The gunshot that killed Harold Larson rang out across the Tucumcari homestead just as the last light of day was bleeding into the New Mexico horizon. His widow, Hannah, dropped to her knees beside his body, the man who had been her husband of 6 years now lying still in the dust, blood pooling beneath him from where the cattle rustler's bullet had found its mark. It was 1878, and the promise of a new life in Tucumcari, New Mexico territory, had turned to ash in Hannah's mouth. The land they had staked their claim on 3 years prior, 80 acres of stubborn soil that Harold had coaxed into yielding enough to survive, now seemed impossibly vast without him to work it. "Harold," she whispered, cradling his head in her lap, not caring that his blood soaked her worn calico skirt. "What am I supposed to do now?" The rustlers had taken their small herd of cattle, every last one leaving Hannah with nothing but the homestead, meager supplies, and the crushing weight of solitude in a territory where a woman alone was considered as good as dead. That night, she dug her husband's grave herself. The soil, hard and unyielding, fought her with every shovel strike. By dawn, her hands were blistered and bleeding, but Harold was laid to rest on the gentle slope behind their cabin with a view of the sunrise he'd always loved. Hannah fashioned a cross from 2 pieces of pine, bound together with rawhide and nailed in place. She hung the small wooden cross that her mother had given her on their wedding day from the center of the grave marker, a simple thing, no bigger than her palm, that Harold had always said brought them luck. "Some luck," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. The following weeks passed in a fog. Hannah rationed her supplies carefully, knowing that the nearest town was a half-day's ride, and she had only her husband's old mare, Penny, for transportation. The summer heat bore down on the land mercilessly, turning the soil to dust and withering what remained of their crops. She worked from dawn until dusk, hauling water from the creek, trying to save what she could of their vegetable garden and reinforcing the cabin against the coming fall winds. At night, she collapsed onto their bed, still made with the same sheets Harold had last slept on, and stared at the ceiling, too exhausted to cry, too heartbroken to sleep. It was during one of these endless nights that the storm came. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters and finding every crack in the cabin's sturdy walls. Hannah wrapped herself in a quilt and sat by the window, watching as lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. In one such flash, she saw Harold's grave marker on the hill, leaning precariously in the violent wind. "No," she gasped, struggling to her feet. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and rushed out into the storm. The rain lashed against her skin like tiny whips as she struggled up the hill, her nightgown plastered to her body, hair wild and dripping. When she reached the grave, she found the wooden cross had been split by the wind, the top half dangling by a few splinters, her mother's small cross nowhere to be seen. Hannah dropped to her knees in the mud, frantically searching the ground around the grave. "No, please," she begged, her words torn away by the wind. "Please, I can't lose this too." But the cross was gone, washed away by the torrent or buried in the mud. Hannah collapsed against the broken grave marker, her body shaking with sobs that had nothing to do with the cold rain soaking through her clothes. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a clear blue sky that seemed to mock her misery. Hannah stood on the porch of her cabin, staring out at the damage. Branches littered the yard, the vegetable garden was in tatters, and Harold's grave stood on the hill with its broken marker pointing accusingly toward heaven. "I'll fix it," she promised aloud, though there was no one to hear. "I'll fix everything." But as the days wore on, that promise grew harder to keep. Supplies dwindled, and the loneliness pressed in like a physical weight. Hannah had neighbors, but the nearest was 5 miles away, and she hadn't seen a soul since the funeral. Pride kept her from seeking help, the same stubborn pride that had brought her west with Harold in the first place. 3 weeks after the storm, Hannah hitched Penny to their old wagon and set out for Tucumcari. The trip was arduous, the sun beating down on her shoulders as the wagon bounced along the rutted trail. By the time the small settlement came into view, Hannah's throat was parched, and her spirits lower than they'd been since burying her husband. Tucumcari wasn't much a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a scattering of other buildings, but it represented civilization in a land that often seemed determined to crush it. Hannah guided Penny to the hitching post outside the general store and climbed down stiffly from the wagon. "Mrs. Larson," called Mr. Whitaker, the storekeeper, as she entered. "Haven't seen you in some time. How are you faring out there all alone?" Hannah forced a smile. "Well enough, Mr. Whitaker. I need supplies." She presented her list: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition for the rifle, nails to repair the grave marker, and a few other essentials. As Mr. Whitaker gathered the items, she could feel his eyes on her, assessing the dark circles under her eyes, the way her dress hung loosely on her frame. "That'll be $4.35, he said finally. Hannah's stomach dropped. She had only $3 to her name. "Could you perhaps extend me credit until the fall? I'll have crops to sell then." Mr. Whitaker's expression softened with pity, and Hannah hated it instantly. "Mrs. Larson, I'm afraid I can't do that. Times are hard for everyone. Perhaps you should consider selling the homestead." "A woman alone. I'll pay for the lady's supplies." The deep voice came from behind her. Hannah turned to find a tall man leaning against the doorframe, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He stepped forward, revealing a weathered face with a strong jaw and eyes the color of the New Mexico sky. He wasn't young, perhaps in his mid-30s, with streaks of silver at his temples, but there was a vitality to him that seemed to fill the small store. "I don't need charity," Hannah said stiffly. The stranger's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "It's not charity, madam. It's a loan. You can pay me back when your crops come in." Before Hannah could protest further, he placed $5 on the counter. "That should cover it with a little extra," he told Mr. Whitaker. Then, to Hannah, "I'm headed out your way myself. Mind if I ride alongside your wagon? These roads can be dangerous for a person traveling alone." Hannah wanted to refuse, but practicality won out over pride. The road was indeed dangerous, and having a companion, even an uninvited one, would be safer. "I suppose that would be acceptable, Mr. Travis. Peter Travis." "Most folks call me Pete." As they loaded her supplies into the wagon, Hannah studied him surreptitiously. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy: worn denim, a faded shirt, scuffed boots, and a hat that had seen better days. But there was something in his bearing that spoke of a different life, perhaps in another time. His gun belt sat low on his hips, the revolver well maintained but not flashy, a tool rather than a statement. "You're not from around here," she observed as they set off, Pete riding a sturdy chestnut gelding alongside her wagon. "No, madam. Originally from Texas, but I've been moving around for some years now. Worked cattle drives mostly, but I'm looking to settle somewhere quieter." "Tucumcari is certainly quiet," Hannah said dryly. Pete chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to surprise even him. "That it is. I've taken a job with the Tanner Ranch about 10 miles west of town. Foreman position." Hannah nodded. The Tanner spread was the largest in the area, running thousands of head of cattle across vast tracts of land. "That's a good position." They rode in silence for a while, the creak of the wagon and the steady clop of hooves the only sounds. Hannah found herself stealing glances at her companion, curious despite herself. There was something solid about Pete Travis, a steadiness that reminded her of the mountains on the horizon, weathered, perhaps, but unmovable. "If you don't mind my asking, Mrs. Larson, what brought you out to these parts? It's a hard life, especially for a woman," she finished, a touch of defensiveness coloring her words. "For anyone," he corrected gently. "This land doesn't give up its bounty easily." Hannah's grip tightened on the reins. "My husband and I came from Missouri 3 years ago. Harold had dreams of owning land, building something that would last. We were doing well enough until cattle rustlers, 6 weeks ago. They took our entire herd, only 12 head, but it was everything we had, and when Harold tried to stop them, they shot him." The words came out flat, emotionless, as if she were reciting something she had read rather than lived. Pete removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, Mrs. Larson." "Hannah," she said suddenly. "If you're going to be my neighbor, you might as well call me Hannah." He nodded, replacing his hat. "Hannah, then." They were nearing the turn off to her homestead when Pete suddenly reined in his horse, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "What is it?" Hannah asked, following his line of sight. "Smoke, coming from the direction of your place." Hannah's heart lurched. Without waiting for her, Pete spurred his horse forward, galloping ahead. Hannah snapped the reins, urging Penny to a faster pace, but the old mare was no match for Pete's gelding. By the time she crested the rise that led to her homestead, Pete was already there, dismounted and examining something on the ground. The cabin was intact. The smoke had been from the small fire pit outside where Hannah did her washing, but her relief was short-lived. As she pulled the wagon to a stop, she saw what had caught Pete's attention: boot prints, several sets circling the cabin and leading toward the barn. "Someone's been here," Pete said grimly. "Recently. The ashes in that fire are still warm, and these tracks were made after the rain 3 days ago." Hannah climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady. "The rustlers? Can't say for certain, but it's a good bet. They might have come back looking for more to steal." A cold fear gripped Hannah's heart. "I don't have anything else worth taking." Pete's eyes met hers, and the compassion she saw there made her want to weep. Sometimes men like that take just because they can, to show their power. He helped her unload the supplies, insisting on checking the cabin and barn before allowing her to enter either. Both were undisturbed, though Hannah noted with dismay that whoever had been there had helped themselves to her small woodpile. "I should get back to the Tanner place," Pete said when they had finished. "But I don't like leaving you here alone, especially with those tracks so fresh." "I've been alone for weeks," Hannah reminded him, squaring her shoulders. "I have Harold's rifle and I know how to use it." Pete nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "I'll ride by tomorrow if that's all right, just to check on things." After he left, Hannah sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the horizon in shades of orange and purple. The vastness of the land, which had once filled her with a sense of possibility, now seemed oppressive, hiding threats in its endless expanse. She thought of Pete Travis, of the quiet strength in his hands as he helped her with the supplies, of the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "Your husband is barely cold in his grave." But that night, for the first time since Harold's death, Hannah slept without dreaming of blood-soaked soil and broken promises. True to his word, Pete returned the next day and the day after that. Each time, he brought something with him: a brace of rabbits he'd shot on the way, a basket of apples from the Tanner orchard, a repaired harness for Penny. Hannah found herself looking forward to his visits, watching the horizon for the distinctive silhouette of man and horse. On his 4th visit, He arrived to find her struggling to repair Harold's grave marker, the cross still broken despite her best efforts with hammer and nails. "Let me help with that," he offered, dismounting and taking the tools from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, warm and calloused, and Hannah felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping back to give him room to work. Pete examined the broken cross, testing the wood with his thumbs. "This pine is pretty weathered. The nails won't hold for long." "It's all I have," Hannah said, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "And I lost the cross that hung from it, the one my mother gave me. I've searched everywhere, but the storm must have washed it away." Pete worked in silence for a while, his strong hands manipulating the wood with a craftsman's precision. When he finished, the grave marker stood straight once more, though the repair was obviously temporary. "I could bring some better wood from the ranch," he offered. "Make a proper marker that would last." Hannah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. After a moment she managed, "I would appreciate that." They stood together by the grave, the late summer sun warming their shoulders. Hannah found herself wondering what Harold would think of this cowboy with the gentle hands and watchful eyes. Would he be glad she had found a friend, or would he resent this intrusion into their shared dream? "Tell me about him," Pete said suddenly. "Your husband." The request surprised her, but Hannah found herself answering. Harold was determined. He had this vision of what our life could be, and he pursued it relentlessly. When we first arrived, this land was nothing but wild grass and rocks. He worked from sunrise to sunset, clearing it, planting it. He never complained, even when his hands were bleeding and his back was so sore he could barely stand. "He sounds like a good man." He was, Hannah agreed, but he was also stubborn. He refused to see the danger until it was too late. She closed her eyes, remembering that terrible night. "I begged him not to confront those rustlers alone. I told him 12 cattle weren't worth his life. But he said they were all that stood between us and starvation come winter." Pete's hand came to rest lightly on her shoulder. He was protecting what was his. "A man can't stand by and watch everything he's built be taken away. But now I'm alone," Hannah whispered, "and I don't know if I can do this by myself." His hand tightened briefly on her shoulder before falling away. "You're stronger than you think, Hannah Larson, and you're not alone." "Not anymore." The promise in those words stayed with Hannah long after Pete had ridden back to the Tanner ranch. She found herself moving about the cabin with renewed purpose, clearing away the cobwebs of grief that had settled over every surface. For the first time, she washed the sheets on her bed now and hung them in the sunshine to dry. She swept the floors, cleaned the windows, and even picked a handful of wildflowers to place in a jar on the table. When Pete arrived the next day, he carried a load of fresh cut pine and a set of carpenter's tools. "Mr. Tanner was happy to spare the wood," he explained, unloading his supplies. "He remembers your husband from town, said he was a hard worker." Together, they set about crafting a new grave marker. Pete did most of the work, his hands sure and skilled, while Hannah held pieces steady and fetched water when the afternoon heat became too intense. They worked well together, falling into a rhythm that required few words. "You've done this before," Hannah observed as Pete carefully shaped the ends of the crossbar. A shadow passed over his face. "My wife. 8 years ago, cholera took her and our son in the same week." Hannah's heart contracted with sympathy. "I didn't know you were married." "In another life," Pete said softly, "in a town in East Texas that probably doesn't even remember our names anymore." "What was her name?" "Elizabeth, and our boy was Michael. He was 6 when he died." Hannah reached out, covering his hand with hers. "I'm sorry." Pete nodded, turning his attention back to the wood. "After I buried them, I couldn't stay. Everything reminded me of what I'd lost. So I took to the trail, worked cattle drives, moved from ranch to ranch, never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. Until now, his eyes met hers. Maybe. The tanner job is good, steady work, fair pay, and the country around here, it gets under your skin. They finished the marker as the sun was beginning to set, a sturdy cross of fresh pine that would weather many storms. Pete set it firmly in the ground, tamping the soil around its base with the heel of his boot. "It's beautiful," Hannah said, stepping back to admire their work. "Harold would have approved." "There's just one thing missing," Pete replied, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out something small and held it out to her. In his palm lay a wooden cross, small enough to fit in the center of the larger marker. It wasn't her mother's cross that was lost forever, but it was similar, carved with care from a piece of the same pine. "I thought you might want something to replace what was lost," Pete explained, suddenly looking uncertain. "It's not fancy," but Hannah took the cross from his hand, her fingers trembling. "It's perfect," she whispered, tracing the smooth lines of the carving. "Thank you." Pete produced a length of rawhide, and together they secured the small cross to the center of the marker. As they stepped back to admire their handiwork, Pete said quietly, "I found the broken pieces of your mother's cross yesterday, buried in the mud at the bottom of the hill. It was beyond repair, I'm afraid." Hannah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "This one is just as meaningful, maybe more so, because it represents not just the past but the present. A new beginning." The look Pete gave her then was so full of warmth and understanding that Hannah felt something shift inside her, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. They stood in silence as the last light faded from the sky, neither willing to end the moment. Finally, Pete cleared his throat. "I should head back. Mr. Tanner has me breaking horses tomorrow, and I need to be at the corral before dawn." "Of course," Hannah said, walking with him to where his gelding waited patiently. "Thank you again, for everything." Pete swung into the saddle with the ease of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. "I'll come by again when I can. Probably not tomorrow, but soon." As she watched him ride away, Hannah felt a curious mixture of emotions: gratitude, certainly, but also something else, something that made her heart beat a little faster and her cheeks grow warm. It was too soon, she told herself. Too soon after Harold. Too soon to be feeling anything but grief. But the heart, she was learning, kept its own time. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Hannah threw herself into work, determined to salvage what she could of her vegetable garden and prepare the cabin for the coming winter. She repaired loose shingles on the roof, chopped wood until her arms ached, and even managed to shoot a deer that had wandered onto her property, providing her with meat that would last for weeks if properly dried. Pete didn't come by as promised, but Hannah tried not to dwell on his absence. He had his own work, his own life. The fact that he had shown her kindness didn't mean he owed her anything more. Still, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats finally came 4 days later, Hannah couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the porch, only to freeze at the sight that greeted her. 3 riders were approaching, none of them Pete. They rode with the loose, confident posture of men who feared nothing and respected less. Hannah's stomach knotted with dread. She knew, without being told, that these were the men who had killed Harold. The lead rider, a lean man with a face like a hatchet blade, raised his hand in mocking greeting. "Afternoon, madam. Remember us." Hannah's hand tightened on the porch post. "You're not welcome here." The man laughed, a dry, rattling sound like dead leaves. "Ain't looking for welcome, madam. Just passing through and thought we'd check on the grieving widow. See how you're getting along without that husband of yours." "I'm getting along just fine," Hannah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'll thank you to leave my property." The second rider, younger than the first with a cruel twist to his mouth, leaned forward in his saddle. Property needs a man to work it. Woman alone can't make a go of it out here. That's my concern, not yours. The third man, silent until now, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. Heard tell you got a new man sniffing around. That Tanner foreman been keeping your bed warm, widow. White-hot anger flashed through Hannah. Without thinking, she turned and went into the cabin, emerging moments later with Harold's rifle. She leveled it at the lead rider, her hands shaking but her aim true. "Get off my land. Now." The men exchanged amused glances, clearly unimpressed by her threat. The leader raised his hands in mock surrender. "No need for that, madam. We're going, but we'll be back. This territory belongs to men who know how to take what they want." His eyes raked over her in a way that made Hannah's skin crawl. "And we want this land." They wheeled their horses around and rode off, their laughter floating back to Hannah on the breeze. She stood on the porch long after they'd disappeared from sight, the rifle heavy in her hands, her heart pounding in her ears. When she finally went back inside, her legs gave way, and she sank to the floor, the rifle clattering beside her. Tears she had been holding back for weeks finally broke free, and she sobbed until her throat was raw and her eyes swollen. That was how Pete found her an hour later, curled on the floor with the rifle by her side, her face streaked with tears and her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Hannah," he exclaimed, dropping to his knees beside her. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak. Pete gathered her into his arms, and Hannah let herself be held, let herself draw strength from his solid presence. When she could finally talk, she told him about the riders, about their threats and their leering looks. Pete's expression darkened as he listened, his jaw tightening. "Those are the men who killed Harold." "Yes," Hannah whispered, "and they'll be back. They want the land." "Why? This isn't the richest soil in the territory, and there's plenty of unclaimed land further west." Hannah shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe it's just that we've already done the hard work of clearing it. Or maybe—" She hesitated, remembering something Harold had mentioned the day before he died. "Harold thought there might be silver on our land. He found some rocks with streaks in them down by the creek. He was going to take them into town to be assayed, but then—" Pete helped her to her feet, guiding her to a chair. "That would explain their interest. Silver claims are making men rich all over the territory." "What am I going to do?" Hannah asked, hating the desperation in her voice. "I can't fight them off alone." Pete's hand came to rest on her shoulder, warm and reassuring. "You're not alone, Hannah. I'll help you." He stayed with her that night, sleeping on the floor by the door with his revolver within easy reach. Hannah lay awake in her bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, feeling safer than she had since Harold's death, but also deeply troubled. In the morning, Pete rose before dawn, making coffee and checking the perimeter of the cabin before Hannah was even out of bed. When she joined him on the porch, he handed her a cup of coffee, strong and black. "I've been thinking," he said, his eyes on the horizon where the sun was just beginning to paint the sky with light. "You can't stay here alone, not with those men making threats." Hannah bristled. "This is my home." "I'm not abandoning it. I'm not suggesting you should," Pete assured her, "but you need protection, at least until we can figure out what to do about those rustlers." Pete's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "Yes, we. I've already spoken to Mr. Tanner about taking some time away from the ranch. He understands the situation." "You can't put your job at risk for me," Hannah protested. "It's not at risk. Mr. Tanner is a good man. He lost his own wife to outlaws before he came to New Mexico. He said to take all the time I need." Pete took a sip of his coffee. "Besides, I've been thinking of moving on anyway." The news sent a pang through Hannah's heart. "You're leaving Tucumcari, Not exactly. I was thinking of finding my own piece of land, starting something for myself." He looked out over the rolling hills that surrounded Hannah's homestead. "This country gets under your skin." Hannah nodded, relief flooding through her. "So what do you propose? About my situation, I mean." "I'll stay here for now, sleep in the barn so as not to cause talk in town. I can help with the work during the day and keep watch at night. When those men come back, and they'll find more than a lone woman waiting for them." Hannah wanted to protest, to insist that she could take care of herself, but the memory of those 3 riders with their cold eyes and cruel smiles stilled the words in her throat. "Thank you," she said instead. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Pete's smile was gentle. "Having a purpose again is payment enough, Hannah. I've been drifting for too long." True to his word, Pete moved into the barn that day, bringing his few possessions from the Tanner ranch. The arrangement raised eyebrows when they went into town the following week for supplies. Hannah could feel the weight of judgment in the stares that followed them, but she found she didn't care. For the first time since Harold's death, she didn't feel like she was drowning. The days fell into a rhythm. They worked side by side, Pete teaching Hannah things Harold had never had time to show her: how to mend a fence properly, how to shoe a horse, how to sight a rifle for greater accuracy. In return, Hannah cooked meals that were far more appetizing than what Pete was used to from trail drives and bunkhouses, and she mended his clothes with neat, even stitches. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset and talking. Pete told stories of his years on the trail, cattle drives up to Kansas, encounters with Comanche warriors, the boom towns that sprang up around silver strikes and disappeared just as quickly when the mines played out. Hannah shared memories of her childhood in Missouri, of her courtship with Harold, of the dreams that had brought them west. Sometimes they would fall silent, content to simply share the space and the moment. During one such silence, nearly 2 weeks after Pete had moved into the barn, Hannah found herself studying his profile in the fading light. The strong line of his jaw, softened now by a beard he'd started growing. The crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled. The way his hands, large and capable, held his coffee cup with a gentleness that belied their strength. "What are you thinking about?" Pete asked, catching her gaze. Hannah blushed, looking away. "Just how different things are now. A month ago I was sure I wouldn't survive the winter. Now I think I might have a future after all." Pete set his cup down and turned to face her fully. "You have more than a future, Hannah. You have strength, determination. You've faced loss that would break most people, and you're still standing." "Only because you helped me," she murmured. "No," Pete said firmly. "I may have lent a hand, but the courage was all yours. From the moment I met you in that general store, head held high despite everything, I knew you were something special." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Hannah's heart began to race, and she found herself leaning toward him almost without realizing it. Pete's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a moment she thought he might kiss her. But then he stood abruptly, clearing his throat. "It's getting late. I should check the perimeter before turning in." Hannah watched him walk away, a mixture of disappointment and relief washing over her. It was too soon, she reminded herself. Too soon after Harold. Too soon after meeting Pete. Too soon for the feelings that were growing inside her like wildflowers after rain. The rustlers returned 3 days later, just before sunset. Hannah was in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables, when Pete's low whistle alerted her to danger. She looked up to see him signaling from the corner of the barn, his finger to his lips. Quietly, she set down her basket and made her way to him, keeping low among the corn stalks. "They're back," Pete whispered when she reached him. All three of them, plus two more I haven't seen before. They're coming from the east, taking their time about it. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. What do we do? Get inside the cabin. Take the rifle. I'll circle around and try to get a better look at what we're dealing with. Hannah nodded, swallowing hard. She slipped into the cabin through the back door and retrieved Harold's rifle from where it hung over the fireplace. Loading it with steady hands, she positioned herself by the window, partly hidden by the curtain but with a clear view of the approach. The riders appeared moments later, 5 men on horseback moving at a leisurely pace, as if they had all the time in the world. The leader, the same hatchet-faced man from before, reined in his horse about 50 yards from the cabin. "Hello, the house," he called. "Mrs. Larson, we've come to continue our conversation." Hannah remained silent, her finger resting lightly on the rifle's trigger. "Now don't be like that, madam," the man continued. "We're just here to make you an offer for this land, fair and square." When there was still no response, the younger rider with the cruel mouth spat on the ground. "Maybe she ain't home, Blackwell." "Oh, she's home," the leader Blackwell replied. "Probably hiding inside, thinking we'll just go away if she keeps quiet." He raised his voice again. "Mrs. Larson, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." A shot rang out, not from Hannah's rifle but from somewhere to the left of the cabin. One of the new riders cried out, clutching his arm as blood blossomed on his sleeve. "What the hell?" Blackwell shouted, wheeling his horse around, searching for the source of the shot. Pete's voice came from behind a stand of juniper trees. "That was a warning. The next one won't be so gentle. Now get off this land." The wounded man was cursing, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. The other riders had drawn their guns, pointing them in the general direction of Pete's voice. "You must be the Tanner foreman," Blackwell called. "This ain't your fight, mister." "You made it my fight when you threatened Mrs. Larson," Pete replied. "Now I'm not going to tell you again. Ride out, or the next man takes a bullet somewhere a lot more painful than the arm." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Blackwell gave a signal and the riders began backing their horses away, guns still drawn. "This isn't over," he shouted. "We'll be back, and next time we won't be asking nicely." Hannah watched as they rode away, her heart still pounding. She didn't move from her position by the window until Pete appeared from the trees, his rifle in one hand, his other raised to show he was alone. She rushed outside to meet him, relief making her knees weak. "Are you all right?" Pete nodded, his expression grim. "For now." But Blackwell was right about one thing: this isn't over. They'll be back, and they'll bring more men next time. That night, they sat at the kitchen table, a lamp burning low between them, discussing their options. "We could go to the sheriff in Tucumcari," Hannah suggested. "Tell him about the threats." Pete shook his head. "Sheriff Wilson is a good man, but he's got a territory the size of some states to cover and only 2 deputies. By the time he could get out here, it might be too late." "Then what do we do? I won't be driven from my home, Pete." He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "And you shouldn't have to be. This land is yours, by right and by law." His thumb traced circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. "There's another option, one that would give us a better chance of holding off Blackwell and his gang." "What's that?" Pete met her gaze, his eyes serious in the lamplight. "We could get married." Hannah stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What? Hear me out," Pete said quickly. "As your husband, I would have legal right to this land alongside you. We could register the claim in both our names. It would give us a stronger position if Blackwell tries to challenge your ownership, especially with Harold gone." "You're proposing marriage as a legal strategy?" Hannah asked, pulling her hand away. Pete ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly uncertain. "Not just that. I care for you, Hannah, more than I should, considering how recently we met. more than I've cared for anyone since Elizabeth died." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "But I understand if it's too soon after Harold. I understand if you don't feel the same way." Hannah's heart was racing, her thoughts a whirlwind. Yes, it was too soon after Harold. Yes, they had known each other only a short time. But in that time, Pete had shown her more kindness, more respect, and more understanding than most people managed in a lifetime. And if she was honest with herself, the feelings growing inside her were more than gratitude or friendship. When he was near, she felt alive again. When he smiled at her, the weight of grief seemed a little lighter. When they worked side by side, she could imagine a future that wasn't defined by loss. "It's not that I don't feel the same way," she said finally, her voice soft. "It's that I'm afraid to trust those feelings. Harold and I had years together, plans, dreams. You and I have had weeks. How can we build a life on such a brief foundation?" "The same way you build anything that lasts," Pete replied. "One day at a time with care and attention." He reached for her hand again, and this time Hannah let him take it. "I'm not asking you to forget Harold or to love me the way you loved him. I'm just asking for a chance to build something new together." Hannah looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her smaller, paler fingers and his larger, sun-darkened ones. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is a lot to consider." Pete nodded, releasing her hand. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He stood, preparing to return to his makeshift bed in the barn. At the door, he paused. "Whatever you decide, Hannah, I won't leave you to face Blackwell alone. That's a promise." After he left, Hannah sat at the table for a long time, the lamp burning lower and lower as she turned Pete's proposal over in her mind. Marriage. The word itself seemed to carry the weight of her past, her wedding to Harold, their life together, his death, and the uncertainty of her future. Would it be a betrayal of Harold's memory to marry again so soon? Or would it be a way to honor the life they had built together, to ensure that their homestead remained in caring hands? And what of Pete? He was a good man, that much was clear. Kind, honorable, capable. But did she love him? Could she love him the way a wife should love her husband? Hannah rose finally, blowing out the lamp and making her way to bed in the darkness. As she lay beneath the quilt, staring at the ceiling, she remembered the small wooden cross Pete had carved to replace her lost one. "Faith ain't wood," he had said when he gave it to her. "It's what you're doing now." The words came back to her now with new meaning. Faith wasn't clinging to the past or fearing the future. It was living in the present, making choices based on what was right in front of her. And what was right in front of her was a man who had ridden into her life when she needed him most, who had stood by her side through danger and grief, who looked at her and saw strength where she had only seen weakness. By morning, Hannah had made her decision. She found Pete in the barn feeding the horses. He looked up as she entered, his expression cautious, hopeful. "Yes," Hannah said simply. Pete set down the bucket of feed. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Hannah took a step toward him, not just for the legal protection or because of Blackwell, but because I want to. Because when I think about the future, I want you to be part of it. The smile that spread across Pete's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He crossed the barn in 3 long strides and took her hands in his. "Are you sure?" Hannah nodded, her own smile growing. "I'm sure. It won't be easy. We both have ghosts that follow us. But I think we can build something good together, something that honors those we've lost while celebrating what we've found." Pete's hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle. "May I kiss you, Hannah Larson?" "Yes," she whispered, and then his lips were on hers, warm and tender, a promise and a beginning all at once. They were married the following Sunday in the small white church in Tucumcari, with only Mr. Tanner, the preacher, and a few townspeople as witnesses. Hannah wore her best dress, a deep blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. Pete wore a clean shirt and a new vest, his hair slicked back with water, his beard trimmed neatly. As they spoke their vows, Hannah felt a curious sense of rightness, as if pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving had suddenly fallen into place. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Pete kissed her with gentle reverence, she knew with certainty that this was where she was meant to be. They returned to the homestead that evening as husband and wife. Pete carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the old tradition, and set her down in the kitchen that now belonged to both of them. "Welcome home, Mrs. Travis," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way she loved. "Welcome home, Mr. Travis," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss him again, because she could, because he was her husband now, because the future they were building together had already begun. That night, in the bed that had once been hers and Harold's, Hannah discovered new dimensions to Pete's gentleness, new depths to the connection that had been growing between them since that first day in the general store. As they came together as husband and wife, the ghosts of the past seemed to recede, leaving room for this new love to flourish. Later, as Hannah lay in Pete's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. "Do you think they're at rest now?" she asked softly. "Harold and Elizabeth, do you think they understand?" Pete's hand stroked gently through her hair. "I think they would want us to be happy, to live fully even after they couldn't." Hannah nodded against his chest. "I think so too." The news of their marriage spread quickly through the territory, reaching Blackwell and his gang within days. True to Pete's prediction, the legal strengthening of Hannah's claim to the land, combined with the knowledge that she was no longer alone, seemed to give the rustlers pause. Weeks passed without any sign of them. As fall turned to winter, Hannah and Pete settled into their life together. They worked side by side to prepare for the cold months ahead, preserving food, repairing the cabin, ensuring they had enough firewood to last until spring. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking, planning, dreaming of the future they would build. Pete spoke of expanding the homestead, of building a proper ranch over time. Hannah shared her hope for children someday, for a house filled with laughter and love. Together, they wove a vision of what their life could be, anchored in the present but reaching toward tomorrow. On the first snowfall of the season, Pete took Hannah to the top of the hill behind their cabin, to Harold's grave with its sturdy cross and the small wooden one Pete had carved. Hannah placed a sprig of evergreen at the base of the marker, a symbol of life continuing even in the depths of winter. "I'll always honor his memory," she told Pete as they stood hand in hand. "He brought me here, gave me this land, this opportunity. And I'll always be grateful to him for that," Pete replied, "for bringing you to a place where I could find you." As they turned to walk back to the cabin, Hannah caught sight of something gleaming in the snow near the grave. Bending down, she brushed away the snow to reveal her mother's wooden cross, weathered but intact, half buried in the frozen ground. "I can't believe it," she gasped, carefully lifting the cross from its resting place. "After all this time." Pete examined the cross, turning it over in his hands. The storm must have washed it down the hill, and then the summer growth covered it. The frost probably pushed it back up to the surface. Hannah cradled the cross in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the connection to her past. Then she looked at the grave marker with Pete's carved cross hanging from the center. "I think this one belongs with my mother now," she said, slipping her original cross into her pocket. "Yours is the one that should stay here. It represents what Harold gave me and what I found after he was gone." "A new kind of faith," Pete smiled, understanding in his eyes. "Faith ain't wood," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken when he first gave her the carved cross. It's what you're doing now. Hannah nodded, taking his hand as they walked back to their cabin, to the life they were building together. And what we're doing now is living, fully and completely. That's the best way to honor those we've lost. As they reached the cabin, snow beginning to fall more heavily around them, Hannah felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. The grief that had nearly consumed her hadn't disappeared. It would always be a part of her, but it had transformed into something else. Something that could coexist with joy, with hope, with love. That night, as she lay in Pete's arms, watching the snow fall past the window, Hannah whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Pete pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for letting yourself be found." Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the land in a blanket of white, erasing the past and creating a clean slate for the future. Inside, the fire burned warm and bright, a promise of life continuing through even the coldest season. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers, and the news that Hannah was expecting a child. When the doctor in Tucumcari confirmed what she had suspected for weeks, Hannah rode home to the homestead with her heart full to bursting, eager to share the news with Pete. She found him by the creek that ran along the eastern edge of their property, panning for the silver that Harold had suspected might be there. In the months since their marriage, Pete had continued Harold's search, finding enough traces of the precious metal to suggest that a small but viable deposit might indeed lie beneath their land. "Pete," Hannah called, dismounting carefully from her mare. He looked up, smiling when he saw her, setting aside his pan and crossing to meet her. "How was town? Did you see the doctor?" Hannah nodded, unable to contain her smile. "I did, and he confirmed it. We're going to have a baby." Pete's face transformed with joy. He lifted Hannah off her feet, spinning her in a circle before carefully setting her down again. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "Our baby. Due in late October, the doctor thinks." Hannah placed her hand over her still flat stomach, just in time for harvest. Pete covered her hand with his own, his eyes bright with emotion. "I never thought I'd have this again. A family. A child." He swallowed hard. "After Michael died, I didn't think I could bear to love another child, to risk that kind of loss again." Hannah leaned against him, understanding completely. "I know, it's frightening loving someone that much, but it's worth it, isn't it? Even with the risk." "Yes," Pete said firmly, "it's worth everything." As spring turned to summer, Hannah's body changed, rounding with the life growing inside her. Pete watched over her with tender concern, insisting she rest more, taking on the heavier work himself despite her protests. Their homestead flourished under their combined care, the vegetable garden yielding bountifully, the small herd of cattle they had begun to rebuild thriving in the summer pasture. One evening in early August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a rider appeared on the horizon. Pete's hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip, but as the figure drew closer, they saw it was Sheriff Wilson from Tucumcari. "Evening, folks," the sheriff said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Sorry to disturb you so late." "Not at all, Sheriff," Pete replied, standing to greet him. "What brings you out our way?" Sheriff Wilson glanced at Hannah, his expression somber. "I've got news I thought you should hear directly from me, especially given your condition, Mrs. Travis." Hannah's hand went protectively to her swollen belly. "What is it?" "We found Blackwell and his gang." The sheriff removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "They tried to rob the bank in Santa Fe last week. There was a shootout. None of them survived." Hannah felt Pete's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "You're certain?" Pete asked. "All of them," the sheriff nodded. "Positive?" "I identified the bodies myself. Blackwell, Morris, Jenkins, and the two others whose names I never knew. They're all gone. You won't have to worry about them coming after your land anymore." Relief washed over Hannah, so profound it made her dizzy. The threat that had hung over them for nearly a year, that had brought Pete into her life but had also cast a shadow over their happiness, was gone. "Thank you for coming to tell us yourself," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Sheriff Wilson replaced his hat. "Least I could do. You folks have built something good here. It deserves to be protected." He looked around at the thriving homestead, at the new barn Pete had built, at the flowering garden. "Harold would be proud to see what you've done with the place." After the sheriff left, Hannah and Pete remained on the porch long into the evening, watching as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. The baby kicked inside her, and Hannah guided Pete's hand to feel the movement. "Our child will grow up without that threat hanging over them," she said softly. "They'll know peace, safety." Pete nodded, his face solemn in the gathering darkness. "And they'll know love, the kind that endures, that builds rather than destroys." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "The kind that finds you when you're broken and helps you become whole again." Hannah leaned against him, drawing strength and comfort from his solid presence. "The kind that reminds you that faith isn't something you hold on to," she murmured, thinking of the wooden cross that now hung over their bed, a symbol of all they had lost and all they had found. "It's something you live every day." "Every day," Pete agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "With every choice, every action, every moment." In late October, as the aspen trees turned to gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter, Hannah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel, after Pete's father, with Harold as his middle name. He had Pete's blue eyes and Hannah's dark hair, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he was loved beyond measure. As Hannah held her son for the first time, Pete sitting beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, she felt a circle closing, a wound healing. The grief that had nearly consumed her after Harold's death would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. In its place was this new life, this family she and Pete had created together. "He's perfect," Pete whispered, gently touching Samuel's tiny hand with one finger. "Yes," Hannah agreed, watching as their son wrapped his fingers around Pete's much larger one. "He is." Outside, the wind rustled through the dying leaves, carrying the scent of autumn and the promise of seasons to come. Inside, in the warmth of their cabin, Hannah and Pete Travis began the next chapter of their story, with their son as the newest page in a book that had started with loss, but continued with love. And on the hill behind their home, Harold's grave stood with its sturdy cross, the small wooden one Pete had carved catching the light of the setting sun, a reminder that faith wasn't something made of wood or words or wishes. Faith was what you were doing now in this moment and the next, building a life worth living, loving with a heart that had known sorrow but chose joy, creating a future from the gifts of the past. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, the homestead flourished around him. Pete's careful exploration of the creek bed had indeed revealed a modest silver deposit, enough to provide a comfortable supplement to their income from cattle and crops. By Samuel's third birthday, they had expanded the cabin, adding 2 more rooms and a proper covered porch that wrapped around the front of the house. Hannah found that motherhood suited her, bringing out a patience and strength she hadn't known she possessed. She watched with pride and wonder as Samuel learned to walk, to talk, to explore the world around him with boundless curiosity. He was a gentle child with Pete's quiet thoughtfulness and Hannah's determined spirit, equally content helping his mother in the garden or following his father around the pasture as he tended the cattle. On the eve of their 5th wedding anniversary, Hannah and Pete sat on their porch after putting Samuel to bed, enjoying the peaceful evening and each other's company. Pete reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Happy anniversary," he said, placing it in Hannah's hands. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a cross, hanging from a fine chain. "Pete, it's beautiful. I had it made from some of the first silver we found on the property," he explained, helping her fasten it around her neck. "Something new to go with the wooden one." Hannah touched the pendant, feeling its cool weight against her skin. "I love it, and I love you." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I have something for you too, though it's not as beautiful as this." Pete unfolded the paper, reading the official-looking document with growing amazement. "Hannah," this says, "that our claim has been expanded to include the northern section we've been hoping for," she finished for him, smiling at his surprise. "I've been corresponding with the land office for months. It was finalized last week." Pete stared at the document, then at Hannah, his eyes bright with emotion. This is everything we've been working toward. With this land we can double our herd, maybe even build that larger house we've been dreaming of." "For our growing family," Hannah said softly, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach. Pete's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Yes," Hannah confirmed, her smile radiant in the fading light. "The doctor says the baby should arrive in early spring." Pete gathered her into his arms, holding her close, his joy too profound for words. Hannah rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. This was happiness, she thought. Not the absence of sorrow or struggle, but their transformation into something deeper, richer, more enduring. Their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Pete's first wife, was born on a clear April morning with the scent of new growth wafting through the open windows. Samuel, now nearly 4, approached his role as big brother with solemn responsibility, bringing his mother cups of water while she nursed the baby and helping Pete with the quiet chores around the house during those first precious weeks. As their family grew, so did their connection to the community around them. The homestead became a gathering place for neighbors, a waypoint for travelers, a refuge for those in need. Hannah and Pete never turned away someone seeking help, whether it was a meal, a place to rest, or work for a season. They honored both their pasts, keeping Harold's grave well tended, teaching their children about the uncle and aunt and cousin they would never meet, but whose spirits lived on in the love that surrounded them. The wooden cross Pete had carved remained a cherished symbol, hanging now on the wall of their expanded home alongside newer treasures: Samuel's first drawing, a pressed flower from Elizabeth's christening, a family portrait taken on a rare trip to Santa Fe. And through it all, through the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and challenges that made up their life together, Hannah and Pete held fast to the truth that had brought them together. That faith wasn't something to be held, but something to be lived. Not a relic of the past or a promise for the future, but a choice made in each present moment to love, to build, to grow, to heal. On a warm summer evening, 10 years after they first met, Hannah stood on the hill behind their home, watching as Pete taught Samuel to ride his new horse. Elizabeth perched on her father's saddle in front of him, her dark curls flying in the breeze. Their third child, 2-year-old James, sat on a blanket nearby, contentedly playing with a wooden horse Pete had carved for him. The homestead spread out below her, the expanded cabin now a proper ranch house, the new barn gleaming in the late afternoon sun, the herd grazing peacefully in the distance. It was more than she had ever dreamed possible in those dark days after Harold's death, more than Pete had thought he would find after losing Elizabeth and Michael. Hannah's hand went to the silver cross at her throat, a habit formed over years of wearing it. The wooden cross, the one Pete had carved to replace what she thought was lost forever, hung in their bedroom, a reminder of beginnings born from endings, of strength found in vulnerability, of love discovered in the midst of grief. As she watched her family, this family she and Pete had built together from the broken pieces of their previous lives, Hannah felt a profound sense of gratitude. For Harold, who had brought her west and given her this land. For the storm that had washed away her mother's cross, leading to Pete's gift. For Pete himself, the cowboy who had found a widow's broken cross and reminded her that faith wasn't wood but action, choice. Life lived fully even in the face of loss. "Mama," Elizabeth called, waving excitedly as Pete guided the horse in a gentle circle. "Look at me, I'm riding." Hannah waved back, her heart full to bursting. "I see you, sweetheart. You're doing wonderfully." Later, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land they had nurtured together, Pete joined Hannah on the porch of their home. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side as she had from the very beginning. "Happy?" he asked softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. Hannah looked out at their land, at the life they had created, at the love that had transformed them both. "More than happy," she replied, "blessed." And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Hannah and Pete Travis sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other in the vastness of the Western Territory, who had chosen to build something lasting from the ruins of what they had lost, who had discovered that the greatest faith of all was not in relics or memories or even promises, but in the simple, profound act of loving day after day through all that life brought their way. It was, Hannah reflected as Pete's hand found hers in the gathering darkness, the most sacred thing of all this choosing, this building, this living. This faith that wasn't wood but what they were doing now, and would continue to do together for all the days that remained to them.